In the spring of 2009, a salvage appraiser named Dale Fenton stood at the edge of a gravel lot in Coleridge County, Nebraska, looked at a wall of dull gray metal stacked against a fence, and called it scrap. He had a clipboard and a magnet on a string and a degree in materials handling from a state school, and he priced the whole pile at 14 cents a pound. He told the man standing beside him that there was nothing here but old lead, that the market for it was the smelter, and the smelter alone, and that sentiment was a poor substitute for a buyer. The man beside him was named Otto Reich, and Otto said nothing. He had heard the word scrap before. 11 years later, in the autumn of 2020, a buyer from a design house in Portland signed a single purchase order across a kitchen table in that same county for a run of cast and finished pieces made from that same gray metal, and the number on that order was $112,000. The metal had not changed. What changed was who was reading it. Let me tell you about the 13 years of dumped type that sat against Otto Reich's fence, and the brand a quiet man built out of what a print shop threw away, because the distance between 14 cents a pound and a six-figure order is the whole story, and it is a story about two ways of seeing the same thing. Otto Reich was 61 years old in the spring of 2009, and he was known in his township for two things. He was known for never raising his voice, and he was known for being able to fix anything cast from metal. He kept a small farm on the north edge of the county, 40 acres of corn and beans he leased out, and 10 he worked himself. And behind the machine shed he kept a shop his father had built, with a coal forge gone cold and a wall of hand tools darkened by 80 years of use. He had worked 30 years as a maintenance man at the grain elevator and the co-op, and before that he had apprenticed under his father, who had been a tool and die man in Omaha before the war. There was always a dog at his heel in those years, and in 2009 the dog was a rough-coated gray shepherd mix named Slug, named for the cast lines of type. Because Otto had a dry humor that only showed in the names he gave things, and Slug lay in the shop doorway through every late pour and lifted his head when the metal hissed into the mold. Otto did not talk about any of this. If you asked him what he did, he said he kept things running. That was all. The type came from the Coleridge Sentinel, the weekly newspaper that had printed in the same brick building on Main Street since 1911. For most of a century, the Sentinel set its pages in hot metal line by line, on a linotype machine the size of a piano, and the slugs of cast type it produced were melted and recast week after week until they wore down and went brittle and had to be thrown out. The dross and the worn slugs and the broken pieces went into pails, and the pails went out back. When the paper finally shut its linotype down in the late 1990s and went to offset, there was a basement full of the stuff and a press foreman named Linus Boyd who did not know what to do with it. Linus Boyd knew Otto. Everyone knew Otto. And so, in 1996, Linus had started backing his pickup down the alley behind Otto's place every few months and tipping a load of spent type over the fence into the gravel lot, because Otto had said once, in passing, that he could always use metal, and because the alternative was paying a hauler. It was a handshake arrangement that was never written down and never priced. Otto got metal. Linus got rid of metal. For 13 years, the loads came, a few hundred pounds at a time, until the wall of gray against the fence stood waist-high and ran the length of 40 feet, and people driving past slowed down to look at it and shook their heads. What they were looking at, though most of them could not have said so, was an alloy. Let me tell you about type metal, because the whole reveal turns on it and you should understand it the way Otto understood it. The metal A linotype casts is not lead. It is lead mixed with tin and antimony. In a precise recipe, somewhere near 84 parts lead, 4 parts tin, and 12 parts antimony. And that recipe was not chosen by accident. Pure lead shrinks as it cools and pulls away from the mold, so the letters come out soft and blurred. Antimony does the opposite. Antimony expands slightly as it solidifies, so it pushes the cooling metal hard into every corner of the mold and holds the sharp edge of a letter. Tin makes the molten alloy flow smooth and wets the mold so the casting is clean. Together they make a metal that casts crisp, holds fine detail, melts at a low temperature a man can reach in a small crucible, and comes out hard enough to print 250,000 impressions without losing its face. Otto knew this because his father had known it, and because a man who can fix anything cast from metal eventually learns what the good metal is made of. He knew that the gray wall against his fence was not scrap lead at 14 cents a pound. It was a tin antimony alloy, refined and blended by a foundry decades ago to do a precise job. And it would do other precise jobs just as well if a man had the patience to find them. He did not say this to Dale Fenton in the spring of 2009. Fenton had come out because Otto's wife, Marta, had wondered aloud whether the pile was worth anything, and Fenton had driven out in a clean white truck, run his magnet over the metal, watched it not stick, and delivered his verdict. "It's old printer's lead," Fenton said, tapping the clipboard. "I can move it to the smelter for you, but I'll be honest, Otto, after my cut and the haul you're looking at, maybe $400 for the lot. It's a hazard sitting there, frankly. I'd take the 400 and be glad somebody's hauling it." He looked at the wall again. "Sentiment's a fine thing, but it doesn't move scrap. This is scrap." Otto turned the word over and set it down. "It's not lead," he said. That was the whole of his answer. Fenton smiled. The patient smile of a man who has explained the obvious to amateurs many times, made a note and left his card on the workbench. He was not a bad man. He was a man who knew exactly what the magnet told him, and nothing the magnet could not say, and the magnet had told him soft, heavy metal, and soft, heavy metal was lead, and lead was 14 cents. Inside his frame, he was entirely right. The frame was the problem. Marta watched the white truck go down the drive and turn onto the county road, and she came out to the lot wiping her hands on her apron. She and Otto had been married 38 years, and she had learned long ago to read the set of his shoulders the way he read metal. $400, she said. It was not quite a question. Otto crouched at the base of the pile and picked up a single worn slug, a line of backward letters cast solid, and rubbed his thumb across the face of it, where a century of ink and pressure had not quite worn the serifs away. "He priced the weight," Otto said. "Nobody's priced the metal." He stood and his knees cracked, and he put the slug in his shirt pocket the way another man might pocket a found coin. Marta looked at the wall, 40 feet of it waist high, and she did not say what the appraiser had said, that it was a hazard and an eyesore and a thing to be glad to be rid of. She had married a man who pocketed slugs. She went back inside and let him stand there. Let me tell you what the metal could do, because Otto already knew, and because his knowing is the engine of everything that followed. Type metal melts at around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough that a propane burner under a cast iron pot will take it to a clean pour. It casts so crisp that for 500 years it held the sharp serifs of letters, smaller than a grain of rice. And it takes a polish. Antimony hardened, it comes off the buffing wheel with a deep, pewter silver shine that does not tarnish to black the way pure lead does a soft moonlit gray, with weight to it, cool in the hand, dense as a held secret. A man who understood casting could pour that alloy into a carved mold and pull out a shape with every line sharp and then he could file it and stone it and polish it until it looked like something a jeweler made. Otto understood casting. He had understood it his whole life. What he had never had, until the wall against his fence grew tall enough to be impossible to ignore, was a reason to point that understanding at something small enough to wear. His granddaughter gave him the reason, though she did not mean to, and, though she spent the first 2 years certain he was wasting his time, her name was Ivy. She was 24 in 2009, just finished with a degree in supply chain management from Lincoln, and she had moved back to the county that summer because the city job she wanted had not come through and her grandparents had a spare room and no rent. Ivy loved Otto. She also thought, in the way of a young person freshly credentialed, that she could see his life more clearly than he could. She looked at the wall of gray metal, and she saw what Dale Fenton saw, a liability and an eyesore, and she said so. "Grandpa." The appraiser said, "It's a hazard. There are kids in this township. If a buyer ever looks at this property, that pile is a problem, not an asset." She had read about liability disclosures in a business law elective, and she deployed the phrase with confidence. It's not an investment. It's deferred cost. You should let the man haul it. Otto was at the bench when she said it, filing the burr off something he had poured the night before. He did not look up. He set the file down, picked up the small object, and put it in her hand. It was a pendant, a single oak leaf, cast and filed and polished to a pewter shine, so clean she turned it to the window to watch the light run along the veins. He had carved the veins himself into a cuttlefish bone and poured the metal in the dark of the shop while everyone slept. "Tell me what that's worth," he said. Ivy did not have an answer. The phrase deferred cost did not fit in her hand the way the leaf did. Let me tell you what happened next, because it happened slowly, and that slowness is the point. Otto did not announce a business. He did not have a plan written down. He had a method, and the method came out of his father's shop and the long habit of his own hands, and he simply began. He taught himself to carve molds in cuttlefish bone, the soft, chalky cuttle that jewelers have used for centuries because it takes a fine impression and burns away clean. He learned to carve in soapstone for pieces he wanted to pour many times. He built a small electric melt pot from parts he scavenged because the propane burner ran too hot and scorched the tin out of the alloy, and he learned to skim the dross and flux the melt so the pour came out without pinholes. He kept a notebook, a black ledger with a cracked spine, and in it he wrote pour temperatures and alloy notes and the weight of each casting and what he had done wrong, in a small square hand, the way his father had taught him to keep a record, so that a mistake was only made once. Across the section line, a younger neighbor named Cole Pruitt was building a different kind of operation, and I want you to hold the two side by side because the county would, soon enough. Cole was 38, ambitious, good with people, and he had taken over his family's 400 acres with a plan to do everything the modern way. He had sat through the seminars, he had the spreadsheets. In 2010, he borrowed against the land to buy a self-propelled sprayer and a new air seeder, and a grain setup with legs and a dryer, $340,000 of financed iron, because the agronomist and the equipment dealer and the man from the bank all agreed that scale was the only way forward, that you got big or you got out, that the future belonged to the operator who could cover the most ground in the fewest passes. The sprayer alone was $190,000. A machine the color of a wasp with a boom that folded out 90 feet wide, and when it came off the truck on a Tuesday in March, half the township drove past to see it. Cole let his boy sit in the cab. He stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and the look of a man who had bet correctly, and the loan officer who had written the note stood beside him and agreed that this was what forward looked like. Cole was not a fool. He was doing exactly what every credentialed voice in his life told him was correct. That is what makes what came later worth mourning rather than mocking. Ivy watched both men that first winter, and she was honest enough years later to say she had bet on the wrong one. Cole's yard filled with bright new equipment, and his name went up on a sign at the field entrance. Otto's shop filled with gray dust and the smell of hot metal and flux, and his output, by any measure Ivy had been trained to use, was nothing. A leaf, small running fox, a band ring with a rope edge. He sold a few at the farmer's market in the county seat for $8, $12, and people bought them the way you buy something from a kind old man, gently, to be nice. Ivy did the math in her head, and the math was insulting. Hours of work for the price of a sandwich. You could make more stocking shelves, she told him once, and meant it as concern. Maybe, Otto said. He was carving a feather into Cuttlebone, and he did not stop. But then I'd be stocking shelves. He blew the dust off the bone and held it to the light and turned it, looking for the line he had not yet cut. This metal was made to hold an edge. Somebody spent a lot of trouble making it that way. Seems wrong to melt it down to nothing, just because a man with a magnet couldn't read it. He set the bone in the clamp. I'm not in a hurry, Ivy. The pile's not going anywhere. He was right that the pile was not going anywhere, and he was right in a deeper way he did not bother to explain. The whole argument of his life, though he would never have put it in these words, was that there are two kinds of knowing. There's the kind that reads a thing fast, from the outside, with a tool that gives a number, and prices it against a market that already exists. And there is the kind that has lived alongside a thing for a lifetime, knows what it is made of and what it was made to do, and can see a use for it that no market has named yet, because the use has not been invented. Dale Fenton had the first kind. Otto had the second. The first kind is faster and louder and almost always wins the argument in the room. The second kind wins the only argument that finally matters, which is the one settled by time and trouble and weather. By 2012, Ivy had started to turn, though she would not have admitted it. The city job had never come through, and she had taken work doing the books for 3 farms in the township, Cole's among them, which meant she saw his numbers up close. She also saw, on a folding table at the market, that her grandfather's little oak leaf pendants had begun to sell to the same people twice. A woman from Sioux City drove down 2 Saturdays in a row to buy a second one for her sister. Somebody asked Otto whether he could do a custom piece, a meadowlark, the state bird, for an anniversary. Otto did the meadowlark. Word moved the way it moves in a county, low and sideways and sure. Ivy started keeping a list of the custom requests in the back of the farm ledgers, not because anyone asked her to, but because she could not help it. She had been trained to see demand, and here, quietly, was demand. Let me tell you about the day the label changed from a hobby to something else, because it happened in public and it stung. In the fall of 2013, the county held its Harvest Festival in the Fairgrounds Pavilion, and there was a small juried craft show as part of it, and Ivy talked Otto into entering. The juror was a man named Garrett Shaw, who ran a gift gallery in Omaha, and had been brought in to lend the show some standing. Shaw walked the tables with the brisk attention of a man who priced things for a living, and when he reached Otto's table he picked up the oak leaf, turned it over, and set it down a little too quickly. Mays? This is cast lead, Shaw said, not unkindly to Ivy because Otto had stepped away. It's nicely done, I'll grant you. The old fellow has a real hand. But you can't retail lead as jewelry. There's the safety question. There's the perception. People hear lead. They think poison. It reads as a folk craft. Sunday hobby. Charming. It's not a brand. He moved on to the quilts. Ivy stood there holding the leaf with her face hot. She knew, by then, enough to know that Shaw was half wrong, that the alloy was not pure lead, and the tin and antimony changed everything. But she did not yet know it well enough to argue, and Shaw had a gallery in Omaha, and she did the books for 3 farms. So she said nothing, and the word hobby sat on the table next to the leaf like a stain. That night she told Otto what Shaw had said, expecting him to be hurt. He was quiet a moment, then he nodded slowly, as if a problem he had been circling had finally shown him its shape. "He's right that people hear lead and think poison," Otto said. "He's wrong about everything else. But the first thing is a real thing." He turned the leaf in his fingers. "Then we'll make it not be lead anymore." Ivy did not understand him that night. She understood him within the year. Because Otto, who had never taken a chemistry class, went to the small library in the county seat and then to the university extension and then, through the extension, to a metallurgist at the State Agricultural College, an exacting, soft-spoken woman named Priya Venn, who tested soils and metals for the college and had never in her career been asked about linotype slugs. Otto brought her a coffee can of the gray metal and a handful of his finished pieces and a single question written out in his square hand on a card so he would not forget it. Could the lead be taken out and the casting still hold its edge? Priya Venn ran the assay because she was curious, and curiosity is its own kind of respect. Let me tell you what she found, because it is the second mechanism the whole story turns on. Yao. The slugs Otto brought were close to the old standard, around 84% lead, but the tin and antimony were the part that did the real work, the hardness and the crispness and the low melt. She told him that there were lead-free pewters built on exactly the same principle, tin alloyed with antimony and a little copper, that cast nearly as well and polished to the same cool gray, and carried none of the safety question. The mechanism that made his metal beautiful did not actually need the lead. The lead was ballast. The tin and antimony were the genius. If he reformulated, he could keep everything that mattered and lose the one thing that scared people. So Otto did something that looked to a man like Dale Fenton like throwing away an asset. He stopped pouring the raw type metal into finished pieces meant to be worn. Instead, he began using the wall against his fence as a teaching stock and a tin and antimony source, refining it, and he blended his wearable pieces to a lead-free pewter on the old proportions. Tin and antimony and a whisper of copper. The pieces came out the same moonlit gray, the same crisp veins, the same weight in the hand. But now a buyer could hear what they were made of and lean in instead of stepping back. Otto had taken the one true objection and dissolved it and kept everything else. Ivy quit the bookkeeping for 2 of the 3 farms that winter and kept only Coles because she needed one steady client while she built the other thing. And the other thing was a business now, whether anyone had said the word or not. She did what she had actually been trained to do. She named it. She gave the little pieces a line and a story, the metal that built a century of newspapers reborn as something you could wear over your heart. And she was careful because Otto insisted to tell the truth in it, that the wearable pieces were lead-free pewter cast on the old printer's recipe, refined in the same shop from the same county metal. She built a simple website. She priced the oak leaf at 68 and held her breath, and it sold. She learned to photograph the gray against dark slate, so the light ran the veins. By the spring of 2016, the shop behind the machine shed had a name and a small, steady line of orders, and Otto, who was 68 now, had hired the first of 2 part-time helpers, a quiet welder's daughter named Rennie, who learned to skim a melt the way he liked it. Cole Pruitt, across the section line, was having a different decade. The years 2014 and 2015 had been good, grain prices high, and Cole had used the good years the way the seminars said to, by leveraging up refinancing the equipment note into a bigger line and adding 160 leased acres so the big machines would pencil out. By 2016, he farmed 560 acres, all of it in corn and soybeans, all of it on the same rotation, all of it dependent on the same chemistry and the same weather and the same prices holding. His operation was a marvel of efficiency. It was also, though no one used the word, a single point of failure repeated 560 times. He had done everything he was told. He had gotten big. Let me tell you about the summer the argument got settled, because it was settled not by Otto and not by Ivy and not by any clever thing a person did, but by the weather, which does not consult a spreadsheet. The drought came in 2017. It came the way droughts come on the plains, slowly, and then all at once, a dry April that everyone shrugged off, May with 1 inch of rain where there should have been 4, a June that turned the sky white. By the middle of July, the corn across the county was curling its leaves into spears to save itself, and the soybeans sat stunted, and the men who farmed the way Cole farmed watched 560 acres of identical, optimized, debt-financed crop bake in unison. There was no diversity in it to fall back on. Every acre had been planted to win the same bet, and the weather had called the bet, and the bet was lost all at once across the whole spread. The county fairgrounds held a meeting that August, the kind of grim meeting a farm county holds when the rain does not come, and the extension agent stood up to talk about crop insurance and stress and hanging on. Dale Fenton was there because by then Fenton had moved from salvage into a seat on the county board, and he said a few words about hard times being part of the cycle. And then, the way these meetings go, the talk turned sideways to who was making it and who was not, and somebody mentioned Otto Reiche's metal jewelry, half as a joke, the old man and his printer's lead. Otto was not at the meeting. He was home in the shop with the door open against the heat, pouring a meadowlark by lamplight while Slug lay in the doorway with his gray muzzle on his paws, too old now to do more than watch, and the dry wind came across the dead corn and into the shop, and did not touch a single thing that mattered there. Back at the fairgrounds, Cole Pruitt, who was sitting in the back with his hat in his hands and a note from the bank in his truck, did not laugh. He had stopped laughing about Otto some time ago. At least it's paid for, Cole said to nobody, looking at his hands. Whatever it is, it's his, and it's paid for. Nobody had an answer to that. What had happened in the plain arithmetic of it was that Otto's operation had no exposure to the thing that broke everyone else. His raw material was a finished pile of metal that did not care whether it rained. His market was people who wanted a beautiful object, a market that does not dry up in July. His costs were his own hours and a little propane in the pewter he blended. He owed no one anything. While the drought erased a year of income from every conventional operation in the county, the shop behind the machine shed shipped 190 oak leaves and ran a small profit, and the gray wall against the fence went down by exactly the weight of those leaves. Because Otto never poured a piece he had not already sold the story of. Resilience, it turns out, is not a feeling. It is a structure. It is having more than one way to be right. Ivy saw it with the clarity of someone who keeps the books for both. She sat at her grandparents' kitchen table that fall with two ledgers open, Coles and the shops, and the contrast was so stark it embarrassed her, because she had spent her 20s certain the bright new iron was the future. Cole's ledger showed a $250,000 crop turned to a $60,000 insurance check against $340,000 in iron debt. So, we are, sa, wa, was, I. The shop's ledger showed a number, a tenth, the size that was entirely Otto's, owed to no one. She closed both books and sat a long time. Then she did the thing the convert always does. She stopped arguing with the method and started asking how it worked. And let me tell you about the Meadowlark and the museum, because that is where the outside judge comes in, and the outside judge is what turns a county secret into a recognized worth. In 2019, a curator from a regional folk art museum, a woman named Hale, who had built a reputation finding overlooked vernacular craft, came through the county seat, researching a show on grassroots metalwork. She found one of Otto's Meadowlarks pinned to a quilt in a member's display and asked who made it. She drove out to the shop. She did not bring a magnet. She brought her eyes and 40 years of looking at made things, and she stood at Otto's bench for 2 hours while he showed her the cuttle molds and the notebook and the wall of gray against the fence, and she understood within minutes what Dale Fenton had not understood in a decade. This was not a hobby, and it was not folk-lead. It was a man reading a material correctly. Hale put 11 of Otto's pieces in the museum show, and the show traveled, and the wall text told the truth. Ivy had insisted on the printer's alloy and the lead-free reformulation, and the 13 years of dumped type, and it was at the opening of that show in the spring of 2020 that the buyer from the Portland Design House first saw the work and asked the question the good judges ask, which is not how much, but how many can you make, and will you keep it honest? She did not haggle. She told Ivy what she would pay and that the number was not an opening position. She wanted a signature run, the oak leaf and the meadowlark and the running fox, cast in the lead-free pewter, finished by Otto's own hand, with the story printed on the card. And she wanted it to stay small and stay true, because small and true was the whole value, and scaling. Ivy understood that completely. She had finally learned the lesson her grandfather had been teaching her with a file and a piece of bone for 11 years. The purchase order came in the autumn of 2020. Ivy carried it out to the shop and laid it on the bench next to the melt pot, and Otto wiped his hands and picked it up and read it once, slowly, the way he read everything. The number on it was $112,000. He set it down, he did not whoop, and he did not weep. He looked out the open shop door at the gray wall against the fence. The wall a man with a magnet had once priced at $400 for the lot. The wall a juror had called a Sunday hobby. The wall his granddaughter had called deferred cost. Then he looked back at the paper, and the only thing he said, after a silence, long enough that Ivy thought he might not speak at all, was the same thing he had said to Dale Fenton 11 years before, in the same flat, quiet voice, with nothing added. It's not lead. The number landed with a weight out of all proportion to its size, because it was not really a number about money. It was the county's whole argument about two kinds of knowing, finally totaled and read aloud. $112,000 was what the world would pay. Once a qualified eye had looked for the thing a credentialed eye had appraised at 14 cents a pound. The difference between those two prices was not the metal. The metal had not changed by a single atom. The difference was everything the magnet could not measure, and the magnet had been so sure. Dale Fenton heard about the order the way everyone in a county hears about everything, and to his credit, he drove out. He stood in the gravel lot where he had once run his magnet, an older man now, and he looked at the wall and then at the pieces laid out on the bench, the oak leaf and the meadowlark catching the light. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I read it wrong, Otto. I read it as what my tools could tell me, and my tools couldn't tell me what it was." He turned a leaf over in his fingers. "What is it, the lead-free? How does that hold an edge without the weight?" And Otto, who had never once said "I told you so," pulled a stool out from under the bench and said, "Sit down, I'll show you." Because the only revenge he had any interest in was teaching, and a man who finally asked the right question has already stopped being wrong. Let me tell you what Otto did with the money and the recognition, because in this niche, the spread is the moral, and the right sizing is the proof. He did not buy iron. He did not lease acres. He did not take the design house up on its quiet offer to fund a bigger shop, because a bigger shop pouring 10,000 leaves would have been pouring lies, and he knew it. He paid off the small note on the melt equipment, and he put a new roof on his father's shop, and he raised Rainey to full-time and brought on 2 more, a laid-off pressman from the Sentinel's last days who knew the metal from the other end, and a high school kid with a good eye for carving. He taught them the way his father had taught him, by the notebook and the hand and the rule, that a mistake is only made once. And he began, deliberately, to give the method away. He taught a winter class at the extension, the one that had once sent him to Pre-Aven, on casting and alloy and reading a material for what it is. Neighbors who had laughed came and sat in the front row. He showed them how to find the tin and antimony hiding in the things a magnet calls scrap, how to carve a cuttle mold, how to flux a melt, how to tell the truth on the card. Cole Pruitt came to that class. Cole had sold the big sprayer at a loss in 2018 and downsized to what the land could carry without debt, and he had started on 20 acres, growing a heritage flint corn that a Minneapolis miller paid a premium for because the drought had taught him in one hot summer what Otto had known all along. That diversity is not inefficiency and resilience is not the past. He did not take up casting. But he sat in the front row, and afterward he and Otto stood a long time at the fence, 2 men who had farmed the same argument from opposite sides, and there was nothing left to settle between them. Ivy runs the brand now. She is past 40, and the supply chain degree she once used to call the pile a hazard she now uses to keep the operation deliberately small, to refuse the orders that would require betraying the thing, to make sure every piece is poured from county metal and finished by a hand that learned at Otto's bench. The wall against the fence is shorter than it was. Meh. At the rate they pour, refining the old type for its tin and antimony and blending it true, there is metal there for 30 more years, and Ivy has stopped thinking of that as a limit and started thinking of it as a promise. When it runs low, there are other piles. The world is full of metal. A magnet calls scrap. The black ledger with the cracked spine sits in a drawer in the shop, and Otto, who is past 80 now and slower at the bench, has been writing in it less and teaching from it more. Slag is long gone, buried at the fence line under a flat gray stone Otto cast himself, and there is a younger dog in the doorway now, a black farm collie named Coin after the wedge a printer uses to lock type tight in its frame, and she lies in the same patch of light and lifts her head when the metal hisses. On the first page of the ledger, in his father's hand, not his own, there is a line written in pencil 80 years ago, faded but legible, that Otto copied onto a card and pinned over the melt pot where everyone who works there can see it. Know what a thing is made of before you tell it what it's worth. Let me tell you the thing this story has been about the whole time, plainly, now that you have seen it work. There are two kinds of knowledge in this world, and they do not weigh the same at every hour. There is the wide, fast, confident kind, the kind with a degree and a tool and a market price, the kind that reads a thing from the outside and gives you a number before lunch. It is useful, it is real, and most days it is right. And there is the narrow, slow, patient kind, the kind that has lived beside one material or one piece of ground for a lifetime, that knows not just what a thing is, but what it was made to do and what it could still become. The first kind measures what is easy to measure and calls the rest sentiment. The second kind waits. A magnet told a confident man that a wall of gray metal was lead, and lead was 14 cents a pound. And that was true, the way a single fact is true, and a whole truth is something else. What the magnet could not say was that the metal had been blended by careful people to hold a fine edge, that it would take a polish like the moon, that it did not need its lead at all, and that a quiet man who had spent his life learning to read metal could turn a print shop's garbage into something a stranger 800 miles away would pay a year's wage to carry over her heart. What is rigid brakes? And the drought proved it across 560 acres in a single July. What is patient holds? And the difference between a hazard and an inheritance, it turns out, was only ever a matter of who was doing the reading. The wall still stands against the fence in Coleridge County, shorter every year, gray in the morning and almost silver at dusk. A magnet still will not stick to it. Quine lies in the shop doorway in the late light, with her muzzle on her paws, and every piece that comes off the bench still carries, somewhere in its weight, the thing the magnet could never read.